Welcome to a Miss Marple mystery. A Christmas no one remembers, a pendant buried in snow, and a secret the whole village tried to forget. Miss Marple knows silence hides the darkest sins. But before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The village of Street Mary Mead had never looked lovelier, or so it seemed to those who gathered in the square that frosty December morning. Snow clung delicately to the thatched roofs, and wreaths hung proudly on each cottage door. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Hayworth, had arranged the annual Christmas luncheon, declaring it would be a triumph of tradition and good Christian cheer. And yet, as the villagers bustled between the church and the Green Man Inn, a strange heaviness hung in the air. It wasn't the weather, nor the cold. It was something subtler and unease, like a half-remembered dream that refused to fade. Miss Marple noticed it at once. From her place by the church gate, bundled in her pale blue shawl, she watched faces rather than decorations. Old Mr. Sims, the grocer, avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Young Molly Trent seemed unusually quiet. Even the normally exuberant Colonel Faraday looked distracted, fiddling with his gloves while muttering something about last Christmas being better organized. Last Christmas. The phrase caught Miss Marple's attention. Everyone spoke of it vaguely, as if uncertain what had actually taken place. No one mentioned the luncheon, nor the carols, nor the gifts. It was as though the previous year had slipped entirely from collective memory. But of course, one cannot erase a whole Christmas. Not in a village like Street Mary Mead, where even a missing pudding spoon provokes discussion. Miss Marple lingered after the service, exchanging polite greetings and listening to scraps of conversation as the villagers dispersed. Mrs. Price, who prided herself on remembering everyone's ailments, frowned thoughtfully when Miss Marple mentioned the year before. "Funny thing, isn't it?" she said. "Can't recall what we did for Christmas at all. I remember the snow, and something about a guest at the vicarage, but no. That can't be right. A guest." Miss Marple's pale eyes brightened. "A guest, Mrs. Price? Do go on." But Mrs. Price had already been hailed by a friend across the road, leaving her sentence dangling like a frayed thread in an unfinished tapestry. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a cup of cocoa, her knitting forgotten on her lap. The church bells rang faintly through the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Christmas that no one remembered. A guest no one could name. And then, perhaps it was imagination, or the flicker of the fire, but she thought she heard the faintest echo of something metallic falling outside her window. When she drew back the curtain, only the snow looked back at her, smooth, untouched, and curiously blank. The next morning, word spread quickly through the village. The verger, while clearing snow from the churchyard path, had discovered something frozen near the boundary wall. A small silver pendant in the shape of an angel, its wings broken clean in half. Miss Marple, hearing the news from her maid, murmured softly, "Angels rarely fall by accident, my dear." And with that, she rose, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and prepared to pay a most delicate visit to the vicarage. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage precisely as the mantel clock in her cottage would have chimed 11, and though she had not brought her knitting, she carried the same composed air of someone who expected to be offered tea and to leave with something more nourishing than scones. The vicarage, stout and sensible with ivy clinging to its cheeks, wore a dusting of snow like a bonnet. Lydia Hayworth opened the door herself, cheeks flushed from kitchen work and eyes overbright with gratitude at finding a listener who never required prompting. "My dear Miss Marple, you have heard about the verger's find. Do come in, I declare. Every third person in the village has already told me the angel must belong to them, which is most improbable, as the thing is quite distinctive." "Distinctive things," Miss Marple said mildly, easing out of her shawl, "have a way of belonging to those who do not wish to be identified with them." The vicar, Reverend Hayworth, hovered by the hearthrug, a volume of sermons in one hand and a look of unhappy duty in the other. "It is a trinket, surely," he said. "Children's ornament, perhaps dropped by a chorister." "Choristers seldom wear silver, dear," Lydia said, "though I suppose Rudolph Peabody's mother is ambitious." Miss Marple accepted tea and listened while the kettle's rattle yielded to the soothing regularity of cups. Her eyes moved over the sitting room with the vague, benevolent interest of a housefly. On the writing desk lay the parish guest book, open to a page whose ink had blotted slightly near the spine. Lydia noticed her glance and smiled a little too quickly. "We keep the book for visitors to sign at Christmastide," she said. "The reading room is open after the luncheon, you know, and we like to record passing friends. It's sentimental, but I am sentimental." "Very proper," Miss Marple murmured. "May I?" "Of course," Lydia said, though her hand went first, squaring the book, smoothing it, displaying a neat column of names. The last complete entries were dated the Christmas before last. Colonel Faraday, whose hand stabbed the page as if bayoneting a memory. Mr. Sims, Molly Trent. Two trippers from the bus who had come in to hear carols and warm themselves. Then, below a patch of blankness as pale as unsaid words, there were hesitant letters, just A, begun and abandoned. "People do trail off," the vicar said, as if apologizing for human frailty. Pen ran dry. "Pens protest when employed, for untruths," Miss Marple said gently. "No date, I notice," Lydia colored. "That was the year of the snowstorm. Everything was chaotic. We had an unexpected guest for 2 nights, and the pipes burst in the annex. I was frantic, Miss Marple, absolutely frantic. I wrote A, to mark that I must enter the name later, and then I forgot. It's absurd of me." "Absurdities are often defensive," Miss Marple replied, but so softly that it might have been the kettle muttering. The pendant had been brought to the vicarage for safekeeping, wrapped in a handkerchief embroidered with a timid forget-me-not. Lydia untied it and laid the little angel on a saucer. The wings were indeed snapped clean across, the fracture glittering like a tiny grin. The body, oddly weighty, had a hairline seam around its neck. "A locket," Miss Marple observed. "It might hold a photograph." "We have not prized it," the vicar said, scandalized. "It feels indecent." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, "it feels very human." She took a hatpin from her sleeve, a habit that made Lydia stare, and with a careful twist felt the tiny catch yield. Inside, the angel's body lay a folded scrap of paper no larger than a postage stamp, and tucked behind it a filament of hair, pale and fine as frost on glass. Lydia's breath caught. The paper bore a single sentence in a cramped, left-leaning hand. "Forgive me for what I cannot remember." "Good heavens," the vicar breathed, then repeated it, as if hoping repetition might conjure sense. "Forgive me for what I cannot remember." Lydia recovered first. "It must be from last year," she said eagerly. "We were all distracted. Perhaps someone suffered a swoon, or drank the rector's sherry a little too freely. You recall, Miss Marple, the fuss about the pudding? There was a confusion over suet, and Mrs. Price took it as a slight." Miss Marple closed the locket again, carefully, and returned it to its porcelain cradle. She did not contradict. Lydia's bustle resumed, but the vicar watched Miss Marple with a dawning unease that had nothing to do with hospitality. She patted his sleeve. "You have thought of something disagreeable," she said. He cleared his throat. "Only this. On the second night our guest was with us. I went down rather late and found the sitting-room window unlatched. Snow had drifted onto the sill. There were footprints, only half a dozen, from the path to the gate and back again. Not ours. I convinced myself a fellow from the Green Man had wandered through the garden on his way home. It seemed kinder than waking Lydia to inspect nothing. Kindness, Miss Marple said, is sometimes only the gentlest form of delay. Molly Trent arrived unannounced while they were considering the locket, her gloves damp and her eyes bright in the manner of a girl who has decided to make herself useful before she is asked to explain herself. She worked occasionally at the vicarage, cataloguing the parish library for a wage that was neither generous nor insulting. Today she carried a basket of oranges for the luncheon and a look that slid off Miss Marple like water off polished slate. "Oh, the angel," she said too quickly, then smiled with a brightness that betrayed rehearsal. "How pretty, even broken. I suppose it's someone's keepsake." Miss Marple admired the oranges, which were of that particularly cheerful shade that comforts English hearts in winter, and observed how Molly's gaze flickered toward the guest book and away. The girl's fingers, taking off her gloves, revealed a faint reddening along the thumb where a band had been recently removed, leaving a paler circle. "They will smell lovely in the church," Miss Marple said. "Citrus is cleansing, don't you think? It sharpens memories." Molly laughed, as if at a harmless whimsy, and then startled like a colt when the vicar asked if she recalled the guest who had stayed. "Last Christmastide." "Guest?" she said. "Oh yes, someone from the deanery, wasn't it? I was mostly in the library. I don't recall names. I never do. Some people remember objects better than faces," Miss Marple said. "An angel, for instance." Molly flushed. "I must take these to the vestry," she said, and left with a speed that sent one orange tumbling under the settle. Lydia clucked over the scuff it might have made on the skirting, but Miss Marple stooped and reached. Beneath the settle, her fingers brushed not only the runaway orange, but the stiff corner of a paper that had lodged where the floorboard cupped. It was a carol program, smudged and dog-eared, the date printed in small type. December 24, last year. Among the hymns once in Royal David's City, in the bleak midwinter someone had penciled words along the margin. Lydia read them, then put a hand to her throat. "Do not trust the snow," she whispered. "What can that mean?" "Fresh snow can conceal as easily as it reveals," Miss Marple said. "There was a thaw soon after, I think." "Boxing Day," the vicar said dully. "A brief thaw, then hard frost again. Miserable weather for pipes. Very suited to muddy consciences," Miss Marple said, and sipped her cooling tea. They walked together as far as the church, bringing the oranges more for the inoffensive purpose than for any urgent liturgical need. And there they found Mr. Sims, stationed like a man guarding his own alibi. He had the look of a person who wanted to be overheard saying that he had nothing to hide. "Dreadful business," he told them promptly. "That pendant. I told the verger as much. Nasty to have such things lying about on consecrated ground." "Where would you prefer them, Mr. Sims?" Miss Marple asked sweetly. "In the high street among the cabbages." He blinked. "I only mean I had my shop door open till late last night. Anyone might have come by, you know. Footprints all over." "Messy. Deliberately so?" Miss Marple inquired, but Mr. Sims failed to catch the hook and bustled away to discuss nutmeg with an elderly parishioner who had never in her life purchased spices without an accompanying lecture. Colonel Faraday, stamping in from the Green Man with a face that matched his name, met them at the church porch. "Found some army fellows in London used to wear token pendants," he announced. "Comradeship, that sort of rot. Break the wings and you'd swear an oath. Sentimental nonsense." "But soldiers are sentimental. Worse luck. Have you heard the rumor? They say the pendant's a sign, a mark of the absent." "Rumors are rarely so clever," Miss Marple said. "They prefer melodrama to code." "Eh?" the colonel said, deflated, and went on to instruct the verger in the proper method for clearing snow, which involved a number of martial metaphors and 2 references to the Crimea. Lydia tugged at Miss Marple's sleeve. "You think the angel belonged to our guest?" she said. "You must." "I think," Miss Marple said, pausing to watch daylight gather like milk in the stained glass, "that something happened last Christmas which no one wishes to remember, because remembering would oblige some of us to be different people than the ones we have been this year." "You make it sound moral." It usually is. They parted at the lich gate, Lydia promising to send the carol program to the police along with the pendant. Miss Marple turned toward the lane that led to her cottage and paused when she saw Molly ahead, standing very still by the churchyard wall. The girl's head was bent, her hand moved as if smoothing something into the snow. When she sensed Miss Marple near, Molly turned, pale but composed. "I dropped my purse," she said, lifting it to demonstrate truthfulness. "Silly of me." "Not at all," Miss Marple said. She looked past the girl to the wall, where the snow had been, patted into a tidy ridge that concealed the faint impression of letters scratched into the frost. A breath would have blurred them. A finger had deliberately done so. Miss Marple could still make out the start of a word. "An angel," Miss Marple supplied. "Angle," Molly said brightly, as if algebra had seized her. "I'm very poor at them." "Most people are," Miss Marple agreed. "Angles, like people, tend to be either acute or obtuse, when one would prefer them simply to be right." Molly laughed dutifully and hurried off. Miss Marple waited until the girl's steps had faded, then brushed the ridge very lightly. A silvery glimmer winked inside the snow. Not metal, but a thread of tinsel, the cheap sort used to dress parish trees. It would have clung to any woolen coat that passed too near a decorated bough. Miss Marple tucked the strand into her glove and went home the long way, noting as she passed Mr. Sims's shop the new sign boasting continental oranges 6 pence each and the neatness of the footprints in the drifted path. Every print apparently following the last, like a soldier's parade. At home, she set the thread of tinsel beside her teacup and took out a little notebook in which she rarely wrote more than a word. Today, she wrote 3: Angel, Ange, and Forgive. She added 2 names, Molly and A, then stopped, because it would be untidy to speculate beyond a letter. She considered the vicar's footprints in the garden that were not his, the unlatched window, the carol program's warning, and the locket's plea to forgive what memory had failed to hold. If memory had failed, it had likely been encouraged to do so. The fire hissed. Snow settled. Somewhere a child's sled squealed along a pavement, and a dog barked in answer, and the village returned to its routines with exaggerated industry, the way people do when they wish to be seen as ordinary. Miss Marple folded her hands and allowed herself the faintest of smiles, not of satisfaction but of recognition. People, she reflected, conceal guilt most completely by persuading themselves that nothing happened. But things always happen. Even forgotten Christmases leave their little angels behind. The following morning dawned brittle and white, the kind of cold that makes even sparrows hesitant to sing. Miss Marple's cottage window framed the snow-draped village like a scene painted in restraint. She sat at her breakfast table, her hands resting on a folded copy of The Times that had arrived damp from the post. Her gaze, however, was not on the news of the day, but on the small object lying beside her teacup, the thread of tinsel she had found near the churchyard wall. In the morning light it looked less silver than pale green, like something that had once shone but had been forgotten. She turned it between her fingers, reflecting that the smallest fragments often carry the weight of entire secrets. The tinsel might have been meaningless, and yet it seemed to whisper of haste, concealment, and perhaps of guilt. The kind of guilt that takes the shape of ordinary actions: patting down snow, adjusting a glove, closing a window too quietly. A knock startled her from thought. She rose, expecting her maid with the cold delivery note, but found instead Inspector Cray standing on her doorstep, his coat dusted with snowflakes and his expression grimly apologetic. He was a solid man, with the resigned patience of someone used to being outwitted by fate and occasionally by Miss Marple. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, tugging off his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not in the least," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Do come in. You'll find the fire more reasonable than the weather." He entered, stamping his boots clean. "It's about that pendant, ma'am. The vicarage turned it in, and we've done what little we can. It's silver, Birmingham make, about 10 years old. No engraving. But the odd thing is, we traced another like it, or nearly. How interesting, Miss Marple said, pouring tea. I always find nearly to be a word of great moral importance. Cray accepted his cup. There was a similar locket reported stolen 2 winters ago from a lodging house in Bath. Belonged to a retired governess, Miss Amy Lytton. She vanished that same week, never traced. The description's near identical. An angel, wings detachable, same hinge mechanism, same maker's mark. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. A vanished governess and a forgotten Christmas. I wonder if the two are not different expressions of the same neglect. He blinked, unaccustomed to her kind of reasoning. Neglect, you say? People neglect what they fear to face, Inspector. It's much tidier than guilt, but the outcome is the same. She leaned forward slightly. Did you find any trace of the inscription? Only the note inside, that odd message. Forgive me for what I cannot remember. Handwriting's female, so far as our people can tell. And there's the hair. We'll send it to London for testing. Though I doubt they can tell much from a strand. Miss Marple nodded. The trouble with hair, Inspector, is that it tells us very little of what truly matters. He gave a small, tired smile. You think the villagers are mixed up in it somehow? I think, she said softly, that everyone in Street Mary Mead is already mixed up in it, whether they know it or not. Memories fade, but behavior doesn't. Watch how people speak, not what they say. Cray looked unconvinced but respectful. There's something else, he said, lowering his voice as though the wallpaper might eavesdrop. The verger turned up more this morning while clearing snow from the south side of the yard. Bits of fabric, dark wool, half-rotted, caught under a stone. Could be a glove, could be something else. Hard to tell after a year. Miss Marple set down her cup. The south side, she repeated. That would be where the garden backs onto the vicarage hedge. Yes, ma'am. We'll have a look presently. I thought you might like to walk over. She smiled faintly. How kind of you to invite me to a morning stroll, Inspector. I shall bring my stick, it's dreadfully icy. The churchyard looked bleaker than before. The snow had crusted in ridges, making the headstones appear like teeth biting up through white linen. Cray's constable had marked off a patch near the wall with cord and pegs, and there, half exposed by the verger's broom, was a small torn scrap of cloth. Miss Marple bent with difficulty, her sharp eyes taking in the weave. Fine wool, she said. Not from a workman's garment, something better made. The constable handed her a small button they'd found a few feet away. It was plain, black, with a faint silver rim. She examined it, brushing away grit. These are not modern, she murmured, and rather expensive for parish attire. Cray crouched beside her. Could belong to anyone, really. Or to no one, she replied. That is always more suspicious. He frowned. You think this ties to last Christmas? I think, she said slowly. That last Christmas left more behind than missing memories. Tell me, Inspector, does the name Amy Lytton mean anything to anyone in the village? He consulted his notebook. Not yet, but I'll ask around. Miss Marple straightened, her breath clouding in the air. Begin with the vicarage. They seem particularly afflicted by lapses of recollection. They left the churchyard, the wind tugging at their coats. When Miss Marple reached her gate, she paused and looked back at the white expanse. The cordoned patch stood out like a scar. She thought of Molly Trent smoothing snow with her bare hand, of the smudged word Anne on the wall, of the broken angel's wings. People forget in order to survive, she reflected, but forgetting, too, leaves fingerprints. By afternoon, the village was humming with rumor. The verger's discovery had become a skeleton in the churchyard by midday gossip, and by evening, half the Green Man's patrons were certain it was the ghost of some unconfessed sin come back to haunt the vicar. Miss Marple, walking through the square under her umbrella, heard snippets as she passed. Buried quick. I shouldn't wonder. That girl, The one at the vicarage she knows more than she lets on. And trust Miss Marple to sniff it out. She always does. She stopped at Mr. Sims's shop for a tin of cocoa and observed him rearranging the orange display with unnecessary energy. "Such excitement over a bit of cloth," he said, before she even greeted him. "I told the inspector. It's nothing but an old muffler from last year's storm. People will have their drama." "Drama, Mr. Sims," Miss Marple said gently, "is what people create when they wish to distract from tragedy." He looked up sharply. "Now, see here, I've said nothing against the church. I keep to myself. Haven't stepped in there since my poor wife passed. God rest her." "I remember your wife," Miss Marple said softly. "A kind woman. She played the piano at the carol service, didn't she?" He blinked. "She did. The year before last. Funny thing, I couldn't tell you what tunes she played. Can't remember them." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "because the music stopped too suddenly." He stared at her, color rising in his cheeks. "You talk in riddles, Miss Marple. If you've something to say, say it plain. Plain words," she said, collecting her tin, "are for plain matters. This one, I suspect, is not plain at all." She left him there, flustered and half angry, and as she walked back through the falling dusk, the church bell tolled 6, slow and hollow. It was the same sound, she thought, that must have rung last Christmas Eve, perhaps at the moment when someone was lost. At home, she wrote another note in her little book. Music stopped. Sims. Cloth. Amy Litton. Then she took the angel pendant from its envelope, studied the faint hinge line, and tapped gently on the seam. Something rattled inside, a sound she hadn't noticed before. Carefully, she slid open the catch again. The paper was still there, folded and brittle, but beneath it, almost invisible against the silver, was a thin disk of glass no larger than a coin. She lifted it with tweezers, holding it to the firelight. Within the glass, preserved like an insect in amber, was a fragment of a photograph, a woman's eye, and the curve of her temple. Nothing more. But Miss Marple's memory was precise. She knew that kind of photograph. The matte texture, the sepia tone, it belonged to the cheap studio portraits taken by itinerant photographers who visited seaside towns. She replaced it, closed the pendant, and sat thinking long after the fire had sunk to embers. The faint creak of her clock marked the minutes like cautious footsteps. At last, she rose and fetched her hat. The lane to the vicarage was empty, except for one figure ahead. Molly Trent, walking swiftly, her scarf pulled close. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her shoes muffled in the snow. The girl did not turn once. She went past the vicarage gate, along the side path that led to the garden hedge, and knelt there briefly before straightening and hurrying off toward the Green Man. Miss Marple reached the spot and stooped. The snow had been brushed away again, revealing the same stretch of wall where the word had been half erased. She brushed delicately with her gloved hand and found, this time, that something had been pinned to the mortar with a twig, a sprig of holly tied with red thread. Beneath it, faint in the frost, a new word had been traced. Forgive. She stood a long moment in the hush of falling snow, the holly trembling in the wind. Church clock struck 7. Miss Marple straightened, her breath a small cloud in the dark, and whispered to herself the same line from the pendant. Forgive me for what I cannot remember. Then she turned toward home, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. For she had begun to suspect that the problem was not that the villagers could not remember, but that one of them, at least, remembered far too well. The next day brought no sunlight, only a dull, colorless sky that hung over Street Mary Mead like an unspoken apology. The snow had frozen overnight, turning the village lanes into glassy veins of ice. People walked cautiously, as though the earth itself might betray their footing. Miss Marple, however, stepped out with her usual deliberation, her stick clicking softly against the ground. Her errands that morning were not arbitrary, they never were. Each visit, each polite conversation, each seemingly idle comment was a thread in the web she was quietly spinning around the truth. Her first call was to the Green Man. At that hour, the pub was nearly empty save for the landlord, Mr. Tom Frobisher, a ruddy man with a suspiciously cheery manner. He greeted Miss Marple as if she were the queen herself, hurrying to wipe a stool with a cloth that was far from clean. "A rare pleasure, Miss Marple," he said. "A bit early for a sherry, I dare say, but I can make an exception." She smiled mildly. "Tea will do nicely, Mr. Frobisher. I only wanted a word or two, if I may. You do keep excellent company here, I understand." He chuckled. "That depends on what you mean by excellent. Plenty of talkers, not much worth listening to." "Even talkers say more than they mean," Miss Marple said. "I'm told Molly Trent was here last evening." His hands paused on the teacup. "She came in for a parcel. Said the vicar had asked her to fetch the choir's collection tin we kept on the counter. Took it away with her." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Was she alone?" "For the most part, yes. Though she spoke briefly with Colonel Faraday, he was at his usual corner. Can't imagine what they had to talk about. The Colonel likes to discuss the Empire. Molly looks as if she's never been further than Bath." Miss Marple accepted her cup and stirred it without sugar. "Did you notice what she wore? Green scarf, brown coat. Same as always. Nothing unusual?" He frowned, considering. "Well, now that you mention it, her gloves were wet through. Looked as though she'd been digging in the snow. But then, everyone's gloves are wet this time of year." Miss Marple nodded as if satisfied. "Quite right. I imagine she went straight home afterward." "I suppose so. Didn't see her leave. The Colonel offered to walk her part way, but she laughed him off. Smart girl, that one." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, setting down her cup. "Too smart, perhaps." When she left the Green Man, the sky had begun to flurry again, fine snow, dry as dust, swirling in uncertain spirals. She walked slowly toward the high street, where the small shop windows gave off a weak glow. At the corner, she paused by Mr. Sims's grocer's. He was inside, rearranging a pyramid of apples with obsessive neatness. She entered quietly, the bell above the door tinkling. "Back again, Miss Marple," he said, too quickly. "Can't keep away from my oranges, eh?" She smiled faintly. "It's not the oranges, Mr. Sims. It's the gossip that comes with them." He frowned, but said nothing. "I hear," she continued gently, "that you once employed a young woman named Amy Lytton before she went to Bath." His eyes flicked up sharply. "Where'd you hear that?" "Oh, memory is a dreadful tattler," she said softly. "It tells us things we'd rather forget. She boarded here, didn't she, just after the war? Helped in the shop for a spell?" Sims hesitated. "Aye, that's right. Quiet one, Miss Lytton. Kept to herself. Left sudden, though, said she'd taken a post as governess. Sent her last wages by post. Never heard again. Did she have family?" "None that I knew." "Why all this interest?" Miss Marple leaned a little on her stick. "Because it seems she may never have reached Bath at all." He paled slightly, then recovered. "Oh, come now. Don't start that talk. I run a decent shop." "Of course you do," she said kindly. "But you were fond of her, weren't you?" He blinked, thrown off guard. "Fond?" "She was a nice enough girl. Honest, polite. She wore a small silver pendant, I believe. In the shape of an angel?" His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Yes, she did. Said it was from her sister, but she never spoke much about her past." "Why?" Miss Marple gave him a long, sympathetic look. "Because one should not wear angels if one means to vanish, Mr. Sims. They tend to come back, you see." She left him there, his hands trembling slightly as he rearranged the same apples once more. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the outlines of the cottages. Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, where the sound of the church bell marked noon. The door was opened not by Lydia, but by the vicar himself, looking weary and older than his years. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. You've heard, of course. Inspector Cray came this morning. They've identified the fabric from the churchyard, a woman's coat, good quality, dark blue. Lydia's been quite beside herself. And the coat? No one knows who owned it. I see, Miss Marple said. Might I speak with Lydia a moment? He hesitated, then nodded toward the sitting room. Lydia was there, hands clasped tightly, the angel pendant on the table beside her. She looked up with a forced smile. Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to ask if we've remembered anything useful. The answer, I'm afraid, is no. And perhaps I might remember for you, Miss, Marple said gently, taking a seat. I believe your guest last Christmas was a woman, middle-aged, modestly dressed, and in distress. Lydia blinked. How on earth do you? It fits the circumstances, Miss Marple said. The snowstorm, the unlatched window, the missing name in your guest book, the angel pendant found in the churchyard, all point to someone who sought refuge here and was quietly forgotten. The vicar sank into a chair. Forgotten? My dear Miss Marple, if such a thing had happened, I should know of it. Would you? She asked softly. People see what they expect to see. A tired woman by the fire, a borrowed blanket, a promise to stay till morning, and then, perhaps, she leaves before dawn. No one notices what she leaves behind. Lydia's hands trembled. But if she never left? Then someone helped her disappear, Miss Marple said quietly. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled faintly. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Finally, Lydia whispered, Molly was with us that night. She came early to help with the luncheon. She said the guest was unwell and should rest. I thought it kind of her to see to her. I never questioned it. Did Molly know her? Lydia hesitated. Now that you ask. She did seem oddly attentive, as if she recognized her. I remember thinking how gentle she was, almost protective. Protective, Miss Marple repeated. Yes, that would explain much. The vicar stood, clearly unsettled. If what you're suggesting is true, Miss Marple, what became of this woman? And why would Molly hide it? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the angel pendant. Because forgiveness, Reverend, is sometimes more dangerous than guilt. If this woman was indeed Amy Litton, she may have come here seeking someone's mercy and received something else entirely. That evening, the snow ceased, leaving a hard glitter of frost over everything. Miss Marple sat by her fire, once more, thinking. She pictured Amy Litton arriving in the storm, a weary governess, travelling from Bath, clutching her little locket and a suitcase. She might have come to Street Mary Mead for help, but from whom? Molly Trent had been young then, perhaps 18. Could Amy have been her mother, or a relative? The resemblance, subtle but unmistakable, flickered in Miss Marple's mind, the same pale hair, the same fragile mouth. Yes, there was a connection, and perhaps Molly had not been helping a stranger at all. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Inspector Cray again, his face flushed from the cold. "We've more, ma'am," he said, breath steaming. "We traced that fabric. Turns out it matches a coat sold at the Bath Cooperative 2 winters ago, paid in cash. And there's a record of the purchaser, Amy Litton." Miss Marple inclined her head. "As expected. There's more. Someone withdrew £10 from her savings account that same week. After that, nothing. The bank says she mentioned travelling to Street Mary Mead to visit a Miss Trent. Does that name mean anything?" "It means everything, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "But I doubt you'll find the truth by asking Molly directly. She's frightened, you see, not of what she did, but of what she remembers." Cray frowned. "Then what do you suggest?" "Let her memory do the work," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes the mind, like the snow, conceals until it feels safe to thaw. When it does, we shall see what was buried beneath it." After he left, Miss Marple sat in the deepening dark, listening to the faint chime of the church clock. She thought again of the holly pinned to the wall, the word written beneath it, "Forgive." It was not a plea. she realized now. It was a reminder. Someone in the village had already forgiven themselves long before anyone else knew what needed forgiving, and that someone, Miss Marple suspected, would not stay silent much longer. Morning that followed was crisp and almost deceptively calm, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Frost rimed the hedgerows, and smoke rose from chimneys in slender grey ribbons. Miss Marple stood by her garden gate, her shawl drawn close, watching as Molly Trent passed by on her way to the vicarage. The girl's pace was hurried, her eyes fixed ahead, and yet there was something oddly deliberate in her manner, like someone rehearsing normality and not quite managing it. Miss Marple waited until she had disappeared around the bend before setting out herself, taking the path that wound past the churchyard. The south wall, where the holly sprig had been pinned, was bare now. The twig had gone, and the snow had been disturbed again, shoveled roughly this time. Perhaps by the verger or someone more anxious to erase than to tidy. But the faint shadow of the word remained, etched like a memory that refused to fade. Forgive. Miss Marple knelt slightly, resting her hand on the stone. So, you've been hidden twice, she murmured, once by snow and once by fear. The cold bit through her gloves, and she straightened, her breath misting the air. At the vicarage, Lydia greeted her with a nervous smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "My dear Miss Marple, you're just in time for coffee. I was about to send Molly to fetch more cream from Mr. Sims, but she's been quite distracted this morning." "Has she indeed?" Miss Marple asked, stepping into the warm hall. "Perhaps she didn't sleep well. The weather can be most unsettling." Lydia led her into the sitting room, where the vicar stood by the fire, staring absently at the open guest book. "It's remarkable," he said, turning as they entered. "The more we try to remember, the less we seem to. I've been reading last year's notes, and yet there's not a single mention of this guest you spoke of. I cannot believe a whole person could come and go without leaving a trace." "Oh, but they do, Reverend," Miss Marple said gently. "It happens all the time. You'd be surprised how invisible people become when others prefer not to look too closely." Before he could reply, there came a light knock, and Molly appeared in the doorway, holding a folded sheet of paper. Her expression was composed, but her hands trembled slightly. "Mrs. Hayworth, I found this while sorting the parish letters. It must have slipped behind the drawer." Lydia took it with mild curiosity. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged at the edges. "Why, it's dated last December," she said, addressed to the Reverend, but unsigned. She handed it to her husband, who adjusted his spectacles and read aloud. "I am grateful for your kindness, though I fear it was undeserved. I shall leave before dawn to avoid distress. Please forget me, as I must forget myself." A silence followed, filled only by the faint crackle of the fire. Lydia shivered. "It must have been from her, your Miss Lytton." "Oh, how dreadful to think we let her go without a word." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Molly, whose face was pale but unreadable. "Forgetfulness," she said softly, "is rarely accidental. Sometimes it is a kindness, sometimes a punishment. The difficulty lies in knowing which." The vicar folded the letter and placed it beside the guest book. "I shall take this to Inspector Cray," he said. "Perhaps it will shed light on things." Molly excused herself and left the room with her head bowed. Miss Marple waited until the sound of her steps had faded, then turned to Lydia. "If I may trouble you, Mrs. Hayworth, might I see the back garden again, the path that leads to the annex?" Lydia looked puzzled but agreed, fetching her coat. They stepped outside, the air sharp and still. The garden lay hushed beneath a glaze of frost, the path faintly visible beneath the snow. At the end stood the small annex, the old servants' quarters, rarely used since the Hayworths had taken the vicarage. Miss Marple walked slowly toward it, her eyes scanning the ground. "The snow lay deep that night, I believe," she said. "Drifts up to the hedge." "Yes," Lydia replied. "It was dreadful. The window in the annex froze shut. I remember because the pipes burst there. Miss Marple paused, stooping to examine a patch of disturbed earth near the wall where the snow had melted unevenly. A dark shape protruded slightly, a remnant of something buried shallow. She brushed it with her glove, and a fragment of blue wool appeared. Lydia gasped. "Oh dear, that must be from the same coat they found in the churchyard." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps it's the rest of it." Before Lydia could speak, the gate creaked, and Inspector Cray entered, his face grave. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Hayworth found you, did I? We've just received a wire from Bath. Seems Amy Litton's sister's been located. Poor soul's been in a sanatorium these past 2 years, recovering from what they call a breakdown." She confirmed Amy did indeed plan to visit someone named Trent in Street. "Mary Mead." Lydia glanced at Miss Marple, then at the inspector. "Molly Trent. She works here." "Exactly," Miss Marple said quietly. "Which means Amy Litton didn't arrive here by chance." Cray looked at her sharply. "You think the girl's involved?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that she's carrying the weight of something she cannot tell." The inspector frowned. "We've nothing on her, ma'am." "No record. No reason." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the annex. "You may find your reason in there, Inspector. Sometimes secrets prefer old rooms." Cray hesitated but nodded, sending a constable for tools. Together they entered the annex, the door protesting with a long, slow creak. Dust hung in the air like a veil. A single chair stood by the window, its seat covered in frost where the glass had cracked. The faint scent of mildew and something sweeter, lavender, perhaps lingered. "Looks deserted," Cray said. Miss Marple walked to the fireplace, where a few charred scraps of paper lay among the ashes. She lifted one delicately with her gloved hand. "Not quite," she murmured. "Look here." The fragment bore a few words, blackened at the edges. "Truth must stay buried." Cray whistled softly. "Someone's been burning letters." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "But not all fire cleanses. Some merely hides the evidence." "Outside," the constable called. "Inspector, you'd better see this." They hurried out to find him kneeling beside the disturbed patch of earth. He had uncovered more of the blue fabric this time, attached to something rigid. As he brushed away the dirt, a chill seemed to pass through the air itself. The glint of metal emerged, a small silver clasp shaped like an angel's wing. Lydia turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Dear heaven." Cray's voice was grim. "We'll have to bring in the men. Could be remains beneath." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then spoke. "You won't find much, only what was left when fear did its work. But look carefully. The truth was laid here long before the snow came." The inspector stared at her. "You mean she was buried here? On church grounds?" "Not by design," Miss Marple said softly. "By desperation." By late afternoon, the garden was cordoned off, and half the village had gathered by the fence, whispering as the constables worked. The frozen ground yielded slowly, stubborn as the silence of those who had kept the secret. At last, one of the men straightened, his expression sober. "We've found something, sir. Human remains female by the look of it. And this." He held out a rusted key, thin and ornate, tied with a faded ribbon. Miss Marple took it gently. "A diary key," she said. "The sort governesses often keep close. I should imagine it fits a small book, perhaps one still in Molly's possession." Cray exhaled heavily. "Then the girl?" "She knows," Miss Marple said. "But knowledge and guilt are not always the same." That evening, the lights in the vicarage burned late. Miss Marple remained seated by the hearth, the angel pendant on the table beside her, the key beside it. The firelight caught the two objects, making them gleam faintly as though they shared the same secret. Through the window, she could see the churchyard beyond the same stretch of snow where the holly had once been pinned. Somewhere out there, Amy Litton had come seeking forgiveness, and found only silence. Miss Marple sighed softly. "You poor, foolish child," she murmured, though it was not clear whether she spoke to Amy or to Molly. "Forgiveness must be earned, not buried." When the clock struck 9, a timid knock came at the door. She opened it to find Molly standing there, her face pale and eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I can't sleep. I keep seeing her by the annex door, in the snow. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Come in, my dear. Warm yourself. You've remembered at last, haven't you?" Molly trembled. "Yes, it's all come back. She came that night, my mother. I thought I'd buried the memory, but it's here, every bit of it, and I don't know how to live with it now." Miss Marple led her to the fire. "You'll live, child," she said softly. "But first, you must tell the truth. Only then can the village and you remember what it tried so hard to forget." Molly nodded slowly, tears glinting in her eyes. "I will," she said, "tomorrow." Miss Marple looked at her long and hard, as though weighing the promise against the shadows outside. "Tomorrow, then," she said quietly. "But the truth, my dear, has a way of arriving before we're ready for it." The fire had burned low by the time Miss Marple persuaded Molly to rest on the settee, a blanket drawn over her trembling shoulders. The girl's eyes fluttered with exhaustion, yet behind them lived the flicker of memory, raw, unfiltered, beginning to surface after long suppression. Miss Marple sat close, knitting in her lap untouched, her gaze fixed quietly on the fire. She did not press questions. People, she knew, revealed more in silence than interrogation. After some time, Molly spoke, her voice soft as falling ash. "It was Christmas Eve, the one nobody remembers. I suppose that's because I made them forget. Not with lies exactly, but with silence. It was snowing hard, and I'd stayed late at the vicarage after decorating the church. I'd gone to fetch my coat when I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, she was there. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket. She looked so small, smaller than I remembered. Thin, her coat all wet through. I hadn't seen her in nearly 10 years, not since I was sent to the orphanage after she left to find work. She said she'd come to see me, that she'd been ill, that she had nowhere else to go." Miss Marple's tone was kind but steady. "And you let her in, of course." "Yes," Molly whispered. "I couldn't not. I took her to the annex to warm herself. Mrs. Hayworth thought she was a friend from Bath, and I didn't correct her. I said she was unwell and needed rest. I meant to tell the truth later, but—" her voice faltered. "She begged me not to. Said she'd made mistakes. She'd been in service somewhere near Bristol, and something had gone wrong. She said she'd taken something that didn't belong to her, a locket. A silver angel. I didn't know she meant that one." Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward the pendant on the table, its dull gleam echoing the weight in the room. "Go on, my dear." "I told her she could stay the night. But she grew worse, feverish. Kept talking nonsense about forgiveness, about not remembering. She said she had come to make amends, but for what? I never knew. Near midnight she was shaking so badly I ran to fetch the reverend, but he'd gone to check the candles in the church. When I came back, she was standing at the window, staring out at the snow. She looked frightened, as if she'd seen someone. I went to her, but she just whispered, 'Don't let them find me,' and then she fell." Miss Marple's knitting needles rested, unmoving. "Fell?" Molly nodded, tears spilling freely now. "She hit her head on the stone by the hearth. I thought she'd fainted. But when I touched her, she wasn't breathing. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I ran outside, into the garden, shouting for help, but the wind was so loud no one heard. I tried to lift her, to carry her out to the church, but she was too heavy. I dragged her toward the hedge. I thought if I could hide her just until morning, someone wiser could tell me what to do. I told myself it was only for a little while." Her voice broke. "But by morning, the snow had covered everything. Mrs. Hayworth said the storm had trapped everyone indoors. No one asked where my friend had gone. And I didn't correct them. I thought maybe it was God's mercy that I could just forget. Miss Marple's eyes softened. But mercy, my dear, is never born of concealment. You didn't bury her to protect yourself. You buried her because you loved her. Molly nodded miserably. I thought I could pray it away. Every Christmas, I'd think of her. Then, when the verger found that pendant, I knew. It was like she'd woken. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Outside, the frost glittered under a pale moon, each branch outlined in silver. Miss Marple rose and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. You must tell Inspector Cray everything tomorrow. Do you understand? No embellishment, no omissions. The truth, in full. Molly shuddered. He'll hate me. They all will. No, Miss Marple said quietly. They'll pity you. The truth frees more than it condemns. Molly managed a faint nod. Within minutes, she fell asleep, the exhaustion of confession overtaking her. Miss Marple watched her for a long time, then extinguished the lamp. The cottage sank into shadows, the faint glow of the fire breathing against the walls like a watchful pulse. But Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat, eyes half closed, listening to the faint creak of branches, the whisper of wind through the thatch, and something else, the memory of Amy Litton's plea, "Forgive me for what I cannot remember." The phrase echoed differently now. Not a confession of guilt, but a cry from someone whose memory had been fractured by illness, by shame, perhaps by both. At dawn, a knock sounded at her door. Inspector Cray stood there, looking tired and cold, his scarf crusted with frost. "Morning, ma'am. We've had word from the coroner, preliminary look at the remains. Skull fracture, consistent with a fall. Nothing to suggest foul play." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "As I suspected. Then the girl's story checks out?" "She has told me everything," Miss Marple said. "But I think there's still something you haven't asked, something only Amy herself could have answered." Cray frowned. "Which is? What frightened her that night?" He blinked. "Frightened her?" "Yes. She didn't stumble by chance, Inspector. She turned toward the window in terror. The question is, what or who was outside in that snowstorm?" Cray rubbed his chin. "You think someone saw her?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "someone followed her. Later that morning, she walked with the inspector to the vicarage. Lydia greeted them, pale and drawn. 'Molly's in her room,' she said. 'She hasn't eaten. I'm so afraid of what will become of her.'" Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "Fear is natural, my dear, but there's one thing more important than fear, truth." The inspector went upstairs to speak with Molly while Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her eyes drifting toward the guest book on the desk. The page with the half-written A still lay open. She studied it a long moment, then turned it toward the light. Beneath the faint scrawl, almost invisible, the ink had bled through the paper in the shape of another letter L. A.L. Amy Litton. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the window overlooking the garden. Through the glass, she could see the annex, and beyond it, the hedge where the snow had hidden its secret. But something else caught her eye, a figure moving by the gate, Mr. Sims, the grocer, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched against the cold. He paused by the wall, glancing toward the annex before hurrying on. She left the house without a word, following at a discreet distance. Sims took the path toward his shop, but his pace was uneven, his glances backward too frequent for a man at ease. When he reached the rear of his shop, he paused again, then unlocked the door and slipped inside. Miss Marple waited a full minute before approaching. Through the frosted window, she could just make out his silhouette, bending over something on the counter. She rapped lightly on the glass. The man started, almost knocking the object over, then hurried to open the door. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, too cheerfully. "Out early, aren't we?" "Indeed," she said. "I find sleep elusive when questions remain unanswered." For instance, what were you doing near the vicarage hedge just now? His face stiffened. Just taking a shortcut. The path's clear there. Ah, Miss Marple said. And the same shortcut you took last Christmas Eve? He stared at her, color draining. What are you implying? That Amy Lytton came to this village for more than reconciliation, Miss Marple said softly. She came to recover something taken from her, a pendant she said was stolen. I think she recognized you, Mr. Sims. I think she saw you through the annex window that night, and that was why she turned in fright. He opened his mouth, closed it, then whispered, I didn't kill her. No, Miss Marple said gently. You didn't need to. Her fear did the rest. But you did take what she carried, didn't you? The pendant she'd come to reclaim. He swayed slightly, gripping the counter. She was mad, I tell you. Came to the shop a year before, raving about debts, saying I owed her money for something I'd borrowed. She said she'd prove it. I told her to stay away. I never thought she'd come back. When I saw her through the window that night, I thought she'd ruin me. So, I hid. I swear. I hid. The next day, she was gone. Miss Marple's expression was calm, almost sorrowful. You see, Mr. Sims, guilt is a persistent creature. It will always find a way back, even if you bury it under snow. You've carried it ever since. He sank onto the stool behind the counter, face in his hands. What will happen now? That, my dear man, Miss Marple said softly, depends on how honestly you speak when the inspector arrives. Confession, like forgiveness, cannot be half-hearted. By the time she returned to her cottage, the first notes of carol practice drifted faintly from the church. The snow had begun again, soft and silent. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking toward the vicarage where Molly sat upstairs, finally unburdened. The angel pendant lay in her pocket, warm from her hand. Christmas remembered, she whispered to herself. At last, and for the first time in 2 winters, the air of street Mary Mead felt lighter, as though the dead had been gently allowed to rest, and the living, at last, could forgive. The next day dawned overcast and heavy, the kind of grey that makes the world seem muffled, as though it were thinking too carefully before speaking. Street Mary Mead stirred late. Even the sparrows seemed subdued. Miss Marple, however, was already awake. She sat by her breakfast tray, the angel pendant lying on the linen beside her teacup. Its broken wings gleamed faintly, and every so often she touched the hinge as one might touch the pulse of a thought. She had spoken with Inspector Cray the night before he had taken Mr. Sims into custody after the man's faltering confession, but Miss Marple knew the story was not quite done. The dead rarely rested when their truth was only half remembered. Around 9, she pulled on her coat and made her way toward the vicarage. The path was clear but slick, and her stick clicked softly against the frost. The village was awake now, murmuring with gossip. Mrs. Price, carrying a loaf wrapped in paper, stopped her by the corner. Such goings-on, Miss Marple. They say Sims has been arrested. Stole from that poor woman, did he? So, it appears, Miss Marple said mildly. Though theft is rarely the whole of a tragedy, people often take far more than objects. Mrs. Price blinked, uncertain how to answer, then nodded, as though agreeing with something profound. The world's a wicked place, she said, hurrying on. Miss Marple continued at her own pace. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and thawing snow. At the vicarage, Lydia greeted her with relief. You've heard, of course. It's all over the village. Poor Mr. Sims. I can't quite think of him as wicked, only weak. Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. Weakness can be a form of wickedness, my dear. It allows harm to happen under the guise of helplessness. Lydia led her to the sitting room, where the fire was already burning. Molly sat by the window, pale but calmer than before. The vicar hovered behind her, looking helplessly kind. She's been very quiet this morning, Lydia whispered, but I think the telling of it has done her good. Miss Marple gave a small nod. The truth always does, even when it wounds. Molly turned at the sound of her voice. I heard they've taken Mr. Sims. Inspector Cray came earlier to ask more questions. He said it was all clear now that my mother fell by accident and that he'll report it so. Miss Marple moved closer, lowering herself into the chair opposite. Then you must feel lighter, my dear. I ought to, Molly said faintly. But I don't, because I keep thinking, if she saw him through the window that night, she must have been afraid of something more than just the past. Something here, in this village. The vicar frowned. You don't mean someone else involved? Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the girl. Perhaps not involved in her death, Reverend, but in her silence. People do not come begging forgiveness unless they have first been wronged. Molly looked puzzled. But what could my mother have wanted here? Mr. Sims said she accused him of owing her money, but she wasn't the sort to chase debts. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the pendant in her pocket. A debt may take many forms, my dear money, reputation, or conscience. She turned to the vicar. Reverend, may I trouble you for a look at the parish registry, the records from 10 years ago? He blinked. The birth and baptism records? Of course, though I can't see. I dare say it will become clear, she said gently. They fetched the old book from a cabinet, its leather cover cracked with age. Miss Marple leafed through carefully, her finger tracing the neat entries. Here we are, she murmured after a moment. April 1919, baptism of an infant, Mary Lytton Trent. Molly stiffened. That's me. Yes, my dear, I thought as much, Miss Marple said softly. Your mother gave your surname as Trent, though she herself was Lytton. That suggests she was not married, but wished to claim some connection that might protect you. Tell me, did she ever speak of your father? Never, Molly said after a pause. Only that he wasn't a good man. Lydia drew in a breath. Oh, poor child. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful, not pitying. Not poor strong. But it does tell us something, doesn't it? Amy Lytton came back here not only for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement. Perhaps she wanted her daughter to have her rightful name, after all. The vicar frowned. But who could her father have been? There's no record. There wouldn't be. Miss Marple said. The past has a way of erasing what it finds inconvenient. But I think I know who did the erasing. Before anyone could ask, there came a firm knock at the door. Inspector Cray entered, stamping snow from his boots. Beg pardon for interrupting, he said, nodding politely to the room. We've got the confession from Sims on paper. He admitted to taking the pendant years ago. Said Miss Lytton had threatened to expose him. He claims he didn't lay a finger on her that night. Seems likely enough doctor confirms the fall was accidental. Molly exhaled shakily, as though a verdict had been passed. But Miss Marple did not move. Her gaze was steady on the inspector. And did he mention why Amy Lytton came to him in the first place? Cray looked puzzled. Said she wanted her pendant back. Thought it proof of something, though he didn't know what. Why? Miss Marple rose, her hands resting lightly on her stick. Because the pendant was proof of a promise made and broken. She turned to the vicar. Reverend, when you read the letter yesterday, the one Amy left behind, did you notice the phrase she used, I shall leave before dawn to avoid distress? It's not the language of fear. It's the language of someone protecting another. Lydia's brow furrowed. Protecting who? Miss Marple looked directly at the vicar. You, perhaps. The silence that followed was thick and disbelieving. The vicar blinked, then flushed a slow, painful red. My dear Miss Marple, what are you suggesting? Only this, she said gently. That Amy Lytton once served here in this very vicarage, long before you were married. That she was sent away under quiet circumstances, carrying a child whose name she later registered under Trent. And that when she returned ill, desperate, still clinging to the memory of kindness, she sought not money, but acknowledgement, forgiveness from the man who had forgotten her. Lydia gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. No, no, that can't be. The vicar's voice came hoarse. Good heavens. Amy? Amy Litton? She worked here when I was first ordained. A bright girl. But that was... He broke off, burying his face in his hands. Oh, dear God. Miss Marple's tone remained calm, almost tender. I believe she came to you that night, Reverend. But you didn't recognize her at first time, and hardship change a person. When she fell ill, Molly told you she was a friend, and you accepted it. Perhaps in the morning you began to suspect the truth, and rather than face it, you allowed the silence to stand. He looked up, his eyes hollow. I thought it kinder. My wife, my parish, I couldn't. Miss Marple nodded. We all tell ourselves such stories. But kindness built on denial is no kindness at all. Poor Amy asked only to be remembered, and instead she was buried twice, once in snow, once in secrecy. The inspector cleared his throat uneasily. This is a delicate matter, Miss Marple. Indeed, she said, but justice is rarely neat. I would suggest, Inspector, that you leave the official report as it stands. Let the record show accident and theft, but not shame. The living have punished themselves enough. Cray hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Aye, perhaps that's best. The vicar rose, shakily, crossing to the window. The winter light washed his face in a pale glow. I will tell my congregation the truth, he said quietly. Not the whole story. Perhaps, but enough. Enough so that she is remembered. Miss Marple inclined her head. That would please her. Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour. Molly, still seated by the window, looked out toward the churchyard. Will she be buried properly? She asked softly. Yes, the inspector said. The coroners agreed to it. Tomorrow morning. The girl nodded, and for the first time her shoulders seemed to ease. Then maybe I can sleep again. Miss Marple touched her hand. You will, my dear. Sleep and remember. Forgetting is a mercy for the heart, but remembering is a mercy for the soul. That evening, as dusk settled over Street, Mary Mead, the snow began to fall again lightly this time, a gentle curtain that softened the world. From her window, Miss Marple watched the village lamps flicker on one by one. The church stood dark and solemn against the whitening sky, the vicar's house still lit by a single window. Somewhere, faintly, the choir began to rehearse Silent Night. Miss Marple turned the angel pendant over in her hand one last time before placing it carefully in a small wooden box beside her Bible. Peace on earth, she murmured, even for the forgotten. Then she drew the curtains, the faint sound of singing still drifting through the cold air, and for the first time that winter, Street, Mary Mead felt as if it truly remembered Christmas. The following morning dawned in soft silence, a faint mist rising from the snow like breath from the earth. The whole village seemed subdued, wrapped in a strange reverence. The church bells tolled early, summoning the villagers to a service that had not been planned, but which everyone seemed to know must take place. It was the day they would lay Amy Litton properly to rest. Miss Marple rose before dawn, her room, lit only by the dull glow of embers. She dressed quietly, her movements deliberate, as though ceremony alone could keep grief from unraveling into chaos. Outside, the world was a pale wash of white and silver, the air crisp and honest. She placed the small box containing the angel pendant into her handbag, then stepped out into the chill morning. The lane to the church was nearly empty. Only a few figures moved ahead. Inspector Cray, the vicar, Lydia walking close beside him, and Molly, who walked apart from the rest, her head bowed beneath her scarf. Miss Marple followed at her steady pace, her stick tapping lightly against the cobblestones. Inside the church, candles flickered weakly against the stone walls. The scent of wax and pine mingled with the cold breath of winter that lingered near the door. The coffin was small and unadorned, draped in a simple cloth of white. The vicar stood at the pulpit, pale and trembling, his voice quavering slightly as he began the service. His words were solemn but hesitant, as though he spoke to the dead as much as to the living. Miss Marple sat near the back, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her gaze never left the girl in the front pew. Molly sat rigid, the stillness of someone who has given all she has to grief. She neither wept nor moved. Her eyes were fixed on the coffin, but her mind seemed far away, turned inward toward memories that refused to soften. When the service ended, the small procession moved out into the churchyard. The sky was low and pewter gray, flakes of new snow beginning to fall. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the vicar's voice wavered again, and Miss Marple saw Lydia gently steady his hand on the Book of Common Prayer. The wind sighed through the yews, and for a moment it seemed as if the world itself bowed in apology. Afterwards, people lingered near the gate, speaking in hushed tones. Miss Marple waited until most had gone before stepping forward. She placed the small box at the edge of the grave, her voice no more than a whisper. "You may rest now, my dear. You are remembered." Behind her, the snow crunched softly. Molly approached, her face pale but composed. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for all of it." "There is no need," Miss Marple replied. "Truth thanks itself when it's finally spoken." Molly hesitated. "Do you think she forgives me? For hiding her?" Miss Marple turned to her, eyes kind but unwavering. "Oh, my dear, forgiveness was never hers to give. You see, it was you who carried the burden, not her. What she wanted most was to be seen, and now she is." A tear slipped down the girl's cheek, freezing almost before it fell. She gave a small nod and stepped closer to the grave, tracing the edge of the snow with her boot. "They say time heals everything," she murmured. "But I think time only hides things like the snow. It looks peaceful, but everything's still there underneath." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite right. That's why one must occasionally dig a little." The girl's lips curved in a small, grateful smile. They stood together in silence until the snow began to fall in earnest. Later that day, Inspector Cray came to the cottage. He looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him, though his manner retained a certain respectful stiffness. "It's all settled, ma'am," he said. "I've written the report as you suggested. Officially, Miss Litton's death was accidental, and the theft is recorded separately. Mr. Sims will face a short sentence for that, but I dare say it'll trouble him more in conscience than in court." Miss Marple poured him tea and nodded. "I should think so. He's not a cruel man, just one who mistook cowardice for cleverness." Cray chuckled softly. "You've a way of saying things that sound like scripture, ma'am." "I've lived long enough to know human nature doesn't change, Inspector. Only the circumstances do." He accepted his cup gratefully. "Still, I'm glad it's over. You'd think such things couldn't happen in a quiet place like this." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "On the contrary, Inspector, it is only in quiet places that such things do happen. Cities are too loud for secrets, they need silence to grow." He considered that, his brow furrowing slightly. "You think we'll see more of this sort of thing?" "I think," she said, "that people will always prefer forgetting to forgiving. It's simpler and far more dangerous." He nodded, not quite understanding, and soon took his leave. As evening fell, the snow thickened again, softening the outlines of every fence and tree. Miss Marple lit her fire and drew her curtains, the flicker of the flames painting long shadows on the walls. She sat by her writing desk and took up her little notebook, the one where she had written Angel, Forgive, Molly, and A. With deliberate care, she added a final word beneath them, peace, but even as she wrote it, a faint unease stirred in her chest. Not dread, something subtler, a prickle of curiosity that refused to fade. She had seen the way Molly's eyes lingered on the coffin that morning. Not with sorrow alone, but with an expression she knew too well, fear of the past's return. And there had been one other thing, a man at the edge of the crowd, standing half hidden by the church wall. Not a villager. His coat was too fine, his gloves too clean, and his face, though ordinary, bore the look of someone who watched rather than mourned. Miss Marple thought she had seen him once before, years ago, perhaps at a parish event or a wedding, but she could not place where. He had stood very still during the burial, hat in hand, and when the final hymn ended, he had turned and walked away without a word to anyone. She closed her notebook and sat back, the clock ticking gently on the mantel. Coincidence, perhaps. But Miss Marple did not believe much in coincidence. She believed in patterns and in people. And people, in her experience, rarely appeared at gravesides without a reason. The next morning confirmed her instinct. The post arrived earlier than usual, and among the ordinary letters a bill, a note from her niece in London, was a thin envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand. She opened it carefully. Miss Marple, you do not know me, though I have lately been in your village. I came for the burial of Amy Lytton, whom I once knew under another name. I am writing only to thank you for what you have done, for giving peace to one who was denied it. There is much that cannot be spoken of, but I thought you should know she was not without friends in this world. Yours sincerely, R.H.F. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The handwriting was steady, precise, the hand of a professional man, perhaps military or clerical. R.H.F. She set the letter down beside her teacup and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. Amy Lytton had come to Street Mary Mead for forgiveness and had found silence. But someone else, someone with the initials R.F., had known her well enough to follow her even in death. A friend? A former employer? Or something more complicated still? She folded the letter neatly and tucked it into her notebook. The story, it seemed, was not quite over. But that was the way, with human affairs. Closure was a word invented by those who wished for comfort. Truth, Miss Marple knew, seldom ended cleanly. It lingered, like the faint impression of a name written once and rubbed away. Outside, the church bells began to ring again, their sound drifting over the snowbound fields. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl, her eyes thoughtful and bright. Somewhere in the ringing, she fancied she heard not mourning but remembrance, a quiet insistence that the past, however long buried, would always find its voice again. She smiled faintly to herself. "Ah," she murmured. "Perhaps Christmas isn't over just yet." And with that, she poured herself another cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate curls, while outside the snow continued to fall, covering the village once more gently, almost mercifully, but never enough to hide the truth completely. The afternoon after the burial brought a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as though the village had exhausted its capacity for talk and was now left in uneasy reflection. Yet beneath that quiet, Miss Marple sensed the faint stirrings of something unresolved, a thread left dangling. She had learned long ago that guilt and truth rarely ended at the same time. The letter from R.H.F. lay on her writing desk, its neat script as disciplined as the man himself must have been. She had read it several times since morning, each reading deepening her curiosity rather than satisfying it. There was sincerity in the words, yes, but also distance, the calculated restraint of someone who knew too well how much to say and how much to leave unsaid. The final line, "She was not without friends in this world," troubled her. Friends? Or accomplices? By late afternoon, Miss Marple decided that reflection would get her no further. She wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and stepped into the fading light. The snow from the night before had begun to melt into thin, glassy puddles, leaving the cobblestones treacherous. The air had that cold, metallic scent that promised more weather to come. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Price was sorting letters with the self-importance of a minor deity. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," she chirped, half whispering as if gossip itself required reverence. "You've heard, I suppose, about the stranger at the funeral?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have, Mrs. Price. I wonder, did anyone see where he went afterwards?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, delighted to be asked. To the Green Man, they say. Spoke with the landlord briefly, then caught the afternoon coach toward Brackford. Nice-looking gentleman, well-mannered, though a bit, how shall I say, military about the eyes. Indeed, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Did he leave anything behind? Not a thing, except, of course, his initials, R.H.F., when he signed the guest ledger at the inn. Ah, said Miss Marple softly. He signed it. That was all she needed to hear. Within the hour she was seated at a small table in the Green Man, the smell of ale and damp wood heavy in the air. The landlord, Mr. Frobisher, greeted her cheerfully, as though nothing so sombre as a funeral had ever taken place in his vicinity. Ah, Miss Marple. Cup of tea, or perhaps something stronger, seeing as the weather's turning again. Tea will do nicely, thank you, she said. And perhaps a look at your guest book, if it's not too much trouble. I believe an acquaintance of mine stayed here briefly yesterday. He blinked, but fetched it without question. People rarely questioned Miss Marple. She flipped through the pages until she found what she sought, a firm, precise signature. R.H. Fenton. The address beneath read, Army Pensioners' Home, Bath. She traced the letters lightly with her gloved finger. Did he speak of knowing anyone in the village? Mr. Frobisher frowned, trying to recall. Not that I remember. Quiet sort. Asked about the church, though. Wanted to know if it had always stood on the same spot or been rebuilt. That's an unusual question, Miss Marple murmured. Well, I thought so too, Frobisher said, but he seemed to know something about architecture. Said it reminded him of an older parish near Salisbury. Had a mind full of history. That one. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, history can be quite a burden, especially for those who carry too much of it. When she returned to her cottage, the dusk had already fallen, and the lamps glowed faintly through the fog. She settled by her fire once more and opened her small notebook. Under the name Amy Lytton, she wrote a new line. R.H. Fenton, Army Pensioner, knew Amy under another name. Then she sat back, thinking. An army connection explained much the formality of the letter. The timing, even the precision in Amy's note. Forgive me for what I cannot remember. Soldiers and those around them often lived by duty and silence. Perhaps Amy had worked in service for an officer's family. Or perhaps Miss Marple's mind moved like a needle through fabric. Perhaps she had been entangled with one. The following morning brought confirmation in the form of another visitor. Lydia Hayworth arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, her face pale and anxious. I hope you'll forgive me for calling unannounced. But something strange has happened. A letter arrived for my husband this morning, postmarked from Bath. It's from a Colonel Fenton. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. R.H. Fenton? Yes. He says he attended Amy Lytton's funeral and wished to extend his condolences to the Reverend. He enclosed a note, a confession of sorts. He writes that Amy once worked in his household many years ago when he was stationed near Aldershot. She was nursemaid to his daughter. Lydia hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. He says she disappeared one night after being accused of theft. But he now believes she was innocent, that another servant confessed on her deathbed. He wanted to set the record straight. Miss Marple folded her hands. How interesting. He feels remorse, then. Deeply so, it seems. He writes that he had been searching for her, hoping to find and apologize before it was too late. He only learned of her death by chance when reading a notice in the Bath Chronicle. Miss Marple sat very still, the clock ticking softly behind her. So, she said at last, he found her, after all, but too late for the living. Lydia sighed. My husband is distraught. He feels doubly to blame now. If only he'd recognized her that night. Guilt is a curious thing, Mrs. Hayworth, Miss Marple said gently. It likes to multiply, even when divided among many. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. What will become of Molly? The villagers are already whispering again. She will bear it, Miss Marple said firmly. She has her mother's courage, if not her mother's peace. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone, the house wrapped in stillness. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the window panes like something alive. She opened the box once more and lifted the pendant. In the flicker of the firelight, she saw what she had not noticed before: the tiniest engraving on the back, nearly worn smooth with time. She held it close to the light. The letters were faint but legible: R, H, F. So the pendant had never been stolen at all, it had been given. A token, perhaps, of gratitude or affection, later mistaken for theft when the giver's honor demanded silence. Amy Litton had carried it for years. Proof, not of guilt, but of a truth no one had dared speak aloud. And when she returned to Street, Mary Mead, she had carried not just the pendant, but the memory of the man who had wronged her and the one who had forgotten her. Miss Marple replaced it carefully, a small sigh escaping her lips. The story had come full circle, though its ending was no happier for being complete. Yet still, a thought lingered. Why had Colonel Fenton come in person, only to leave without a word? Men of conscience often sought witness to their repentance. Perhaps he had needed to see the grave, to know it was real. Or perhaps there had been another reason. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Molly stood there, her face drawn, but her eyes strangely calm. "I found something," she said, holding out a folded paper, in one of Mother's old prayer books. It was tucked between the pages. Miss Marple led her in and unfolded the note. The writing was shaky, uncertain, but clearly Amy's, for Mary, if she should ever find this. "There are things a woman must bear alone. I did not steal, though they said I did. The locket was given to me by one who pitied me too kindly. I came back only to tell the truth and to beg forgiveness from the one who never knew he was my sin as well as my salvation. If you are reading this, remember, what is forgotten can still be forgiven, but what is hidden never can." Molly's voice broke as she whispered, "She meant the Reverend, didn't she?" Miss Marple folded the note carefully. "Yes, my dear, but she also meant herself. And now you." The girl wiped her eyes. "I think I understand." She didn't want to be pitied, only remembered. "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly, "and you have done that for her." When Molly had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the dying fire, the pendant and the note beside her. She thought of Amy Litton, of Colonel Fenton, of the vicar and his pale wife, and of the quiet ache that lived in all of them, the ache of the past, never properly buried. Outside, the church bell tolled once, its sound deep and resonant, rolling across the frozen fields like a benediction. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains, and whispered into the quiet, "It is finished now." But even as she said it, she knew that stories such as these never truly finished. They only settled, like snow, covering what must rest, and leaving, just faintly, the shape of what had been beneath. That night the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint, mournful rustle of the churchyard trees. Miss Marple sat awake in her chair by the dying fire, her knitting untouched, the letter from Colonel Fenton and Amy's final note lying side by side on the table. Outside, the snow had begun once more, soft and relentless. It whispered against the window panes, and somewhere beyond, a gate creaked in the wind. She could not sleep. There was a restlessness in her, the sense that something still moved beneath the calm surface they had all tried to lay over the truth. Every thread of the story had been gathered, yet some part of her mind, quiet but insistent, kept circling back to the same small, troubling detail. The timing of Colonel Fenton's letter. It had been written before the funeral, posted from Bath, yet he had also been seen here in the village on that very day. The letter had arrived after his departure, but it must have been written before his visit. That, to Miss Marple's mind, was not merely strange, it was deliberate. She rose, went to the window, and looked out into the snow. The village lay silent, a patchwork of white roofs and faint lamplight. The church steeple stood dark against the pale sky, its bell motionless. For a moment, she thought she saw movement near the gate, the brief, uncertain figure of a man crossing the square, but when she blinked, the space was empty again. She turned back to the fire, stirred it absently, and said to herself, "There are letters meant to be found, and letters meant to mislead." By morning, the world was transformed. The snow had deepened, the roads near impassable. Mrs. Price came round first thing with the news, half breathless, half gleeful, that the telephone lines were down and that no one had been able to reach the next village since dawn. "Beastly storm," she said cheerfully, shaking snow from her boots. "Still, I do think it's all rather romantic, don't you? Just like one of those mystery stories you enjoy. Miss Marple trapped in the village. No way out." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Let us hope our mystery has already had its ending, my dear." But when Mrs. Price had gone, her smile faded. She made her way to the vicarage after breakfast, a basket of preserves in her hand as excuse. Lydia greeted her warmly enough, though she looked pale and exhausted. "It's been a trying week," she said. "The Reverend's gone to the church to say prayers for Amy's soul. He means to ring the bell himself, says the snow has muffled the sound too much lately." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes wandering to the writing desk. The letter from Colonel Fenton lay there still, neatly folded. "You've heard nothing more from the Colonel, I suppose?" Lydia shook her head. "No, I can't imagine we shall. He seemed a man of conscience. Perhaps he has said all he needed to." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "though men of conscience often write twice, once for others and once for themselves." She left soon after, stepping carefully along the path toward the church. The air had that crisp sharpness peculiar to English winter mornings, and the sky was heavy with unfallen snow. As she neared the gate, the bell tolled once, low and steady, and then again. She entered quietly, her breath a white plume before her. Inside, the sound echoed off the stone, and she saw the vicar standing by the altar, the rope of the bell cord still swinging in his hand. He turned, startled. "Miss Marple, forgive me, I didn't hear you come in." She smiled gently. "One rarely hears what one is not listening for, Reverend. I came to see how you were." He looked older than he had a week before. "It has been a difficult reconciliation. I have prayed for her soul, and for my own. I cannot pretend that prayer brings peace easily." "It seldom does," Miss Marple said, "but it does bring truth nearer, if one listens closely enough." The vicar's gaze flickered uncertainly. "You speak as though you think the matter unfinished." Miss Marple stepped closer. "I think, perhaps, Colonel Fenton's letter was not written for you alone. I believe he sent it here knowing someone else would read it first." The vicar's brow furrowed. "Lydia," Miss Marple hesitated, her voice almost kind. "Your wife has borne much, Reverend. I imagine she knew of Amy Lytton long before you did. Wives notice things, names, glances, the way guilt lingers. Perhaps she found the letter before you and understood its meaning." The vicar paled. "Good heavens. Lydia, you can't mean—" "I mean," Miss Marple said quietly, "that forgiveness is a difficult thing to offer and an even harder thing to share. When a woman discovers her husband's past through another woman's suffering, she may feel compassion, or she may feel the quiet fury of having lived beside a lie. Lydia Hayworth is kind. Yes, but kindness can become a weapon when it means to wound gently." The vicar sank onto the nearest pew, stricken. "You think she knew before Amy came back?" "I think she guessed," Miss Marple replied. "And when Amy returned, desperate and ill, I think Lydia saw not a ghost, but a chance to let time do what anger could not. I think she said nothing, not to you, not to anyone, because silence would accomplish what confession never could. And when Amy died, she buried the truth to protect you from scandal and herself from pity." The vicar's voice broke. "Lydia wouldn't. She couldn't. Miss Marple's tone softened. "Oh, Reverend, you misunderstand me. I do not accuse her of malice. I think she found Amy's body that night, before the storm covered the ground. She did not kill her. She merely closed the window, shut the door, and told herself it was too late. It was, after all, a sin born of love, the kind that hides rather than harms." The vicar pressed his hands to his face. "Dear God." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You must not judge her too harshly. We all protect what we fear to lose. She feared her husband's soul might never be hers again, and perhaps she was right." They sat in silence for a long time, the cold stone of the church absorbing their shared confession. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, muffling the world in white. At last, the vicar rose, voice trembling. "I shall speak to her." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, she has already spoken in the only way she can. Leave her peace be, Reverend. The dead have their rest. The living must earn theirs." He nodded slowly, eyes distant. "You are a merciful woman, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "No, merely observant. Mercy belongs to God." That afternoon, as she made her way home, she saw Lydia standing by the churchyard gate, her gloved hand resting on the stone. She looked up as Miss Marple passed, their eyes meeting briefly. There was no need for words. Lydia's expression held both sorrow and understanding, the quiet dignity of someone who had accepted the cost of her own silence. The storm, worsened by evening, wind clawed at the windows, and the trees groaned beneath their weight of snow. Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, her knitting in her lap, and listened. The house creaked like an old memory settling into itself. There was a faint knock at the door, hesitant, almost apologetic. She rose, opened it, and found Molly standing there again, wrapped in a thin shawl. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her eyes luminous. "I couldn't stay," the girl said. "I felt I had to see you. Come in, my dear. The wind bites tonight." Molly stepped inside, her hands trembling as she held out the prayer book. I read her note again, and I think she meant me to forgive them all. Not just the Reverend, not even Mr. Sims, but everyone who forgot her. I don't know how, but I want to try." Miss Marple smiled, a warmth spreading in her voice. "Then you already have, my dear. Forgiveness isn't given, it's begun." They sat by the fire, the storm howling outside, and Miss Marple told her gently of the quiet courage it takes to remember without bitterness. When at last the clock chimed midnight, the storm began to ease. The wind fell, and the world outside grew still again. Later, when Molly had gone, and the house was once more empty, Miss Marple rose and opened her curtains. The snow had stopped. The moon hung low and clear, lighting the village in silver. In the churchyard, Amy Litton's grave was smooth and unbroken beneath the new-fallen snow. Miss Marple stood for a long time watching, her breath misting the glass. The story had ended not neatly, but truly. There would be no more talk, no more whispers. Only memory, quiet and unassuming, lingering like candle smoke. She closed the curtains, stirred the fire once more, and whispered softly into the warmth, "Peace on earth, at last." And somewhere outside, as if in answer, the church bell tolled once a sound neither mournful nor solemn, but clear and low and steady, carrying across Street Mary Mead like a benediction for the living and the dead alike.